I've spent the last week playtesting Modern Horizons 3 brews both in paper with my friend Young Dingo and also on Magic Online during the early access content creator event. MH3 doesn't fully release on Magic Online until tomorrow, so I thought it'd be good to do a little bit of yapping about the decks we playtested during this time. Today I'm going to talk about 16 total decks that I playtested over the course of this week, and of course we should obviously start with the good decks. If you had told me 2 weeks ago that the most impressive deck initially in our MH3 playtesting was going to be a Boros Boombust deck, I would have not believed you. But after going 12-0 in paper matches with and against Young Dingo, both of us taking turns piloting the deck and also 3-2ing a league in the streamer event, I am really, really impressed by Boros Energy midrange. And I think it's good for you to probably push away any preconceived notions you have about Boros Boombust decks, Boros midrange decks in Modern, because aside for 4 Ragavan and 4 Boombust, every single other spell in the main deck of this deck is a Modern Horizons 3 card. The deck is really a pretty normal mid-rangey deck where you're just playing super efficient threats, Amtraptor, Guide of Souls, Felia, Flage, Ragavan, White Orchid Phantom, and because we're Boros and we don't have access to counter spells or discard spells, what we need to do is interact with our opponent's mana to try to disrupt big mana in combo decks, which is why we're playing the Boombust and it's why we're playing the White Orchid Phantoms. Then you get access to some really potent, powerful removal spells, Galvanic Discharge, removal spell that can either gain you energy when you kill a low toughness creature or spend some extra energy to kill a creature with a lot of toughness. Static Prison, a 1-mana enchantment that can get rid of any non-land permanent an opponent controls on the battlefield, although you have to spend an energy every turn to keep it around. It does come with a 2-mana initial investment to get you going. And to tie it all together, you get to play 4 copies of Unstable Amulet, which might just be one of the best card advantage engines going into MH3. 2-mana artifact, when it enters you get 2 energy, you can tap it, spend 2 energy to exile a card from the top of your library, and you can play that card until you exile another card with Unstable Amulet. And every single time you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, Amulet deals 1 damage to your opponent. This isn't just from casting cards off of Unstable Amulet, you also get to deal extra damage when you escape Flage in this deck, which is surprisingly really, really real late game damage. And with your energy generation from Guide of Souls, Amtraptor, Galvanic Discharge, and also just flickering your Unstable Amulet with Felia or bouncing with Essence Reliquary, it is not that tough for Unstable Amulet to draw you, effectively drawing you 4 or 5 cards over the course of the game. And also, it's really notable, this is a card advantage engine that does not trigger your opponent's Orcish Bowmasters, does not trigger your opponent's Shieldred, which is a very, very big deal. Also playing 1 Essence Reliquary, it's kind of cheeky 5th card advantage card, something that can bounce Amtraptor, replay Amtraptor to get a free spell, reset Unstable Amulet for more energy, bounce White Orchid Phantom to deal with your opponent's lands, etc., etc. You could also cast Flage, bounce Flage, replay Flage for some extra damage. A lot of stuff going on. At the moment, I think the first copy of Essence Reliquary is a really, really good grindy card advantage tool. And simply put, this deck is a pile of all the best threats of the format, some really powerful interaction for your opponent's lands, some really powerful card advantage cards, and it's also pretty hard to race because you have a good amount of life gain between Flage and Guide of Souls. Funny enough, I feel like the worst card of this main deck by a lot is Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, which maybe speaks for the quality of the deck overall. But Ragavan at the moment has mostly been in this deck for mana curve considerations. You really want one more potent 1-mana threat, but I have found myself boarding out Ragavan in almost every single matchup. There's just not many decks that are not going to be able to block this card super easily. There's not many decks that can't clean it up easily with a card like Orcish Bowmasters. And I've just been really unhappy to register it. So I am not sure exactly what you want to cut the Ragavans for. I'm thinking at the moment you play 2 Lightning Bolts and try maybe 2 of the new Ajanis, but probably going to be cutting the Ragavans going forward the next time I play this deck. And because the deck is a really proactive, sorcery speed, energy focused deck, I found that Amtraptor was just really, really absurd. In my opinion, the best card in the deck. Almost every single card here is a really proactive, cheap threat. You can even hit your 3-drops on turn 2 if you lead on a Galvanic Discharge, Guide of Souls, or Aether Hub. And Amtraptor is just a 2-mana, 2/1 first striker that comes with another really powerful proactive threat attached to it most of the time. Sometimes you're going to hit a removal spell and, hopefully your opponent has a creature in play. But when Raptor hits a Felia, a Guide of Souls, a Flage, a Ragavan, a White Orchid Phantom, a Boombust, Unstable Amulet, Essence, just the whole deck. It's just wild. It's just really, really wild. And you play Amtraptor on 2, and you're just ahead on board, and you just kind of snowball against your opponent. You destroy their lands, and things get out of control really, really quickly. This is definitely a deck I recommend. I think there's a lot of room to grow and evolve and change and metagame, all that, buzzword nonsense. I did like Monumental Hinge as a utility land mana sink here. And there's untapped if you control planes. You have a lot more planes and white sources here than you have red sources for the Haste Exert land, which is something a lot of people want to play with Felia. And you have a ton of historic cards to hit off Monumental Hinge. You have Flagstones, you have Rustfield Bridge, you have Unstable Amulet, you have Essence Reliquary, you have Flage, Felia, Ragavan, although I think you probably cut the Ragavans going forward. So really nice mana sink card advantage tool, a card that I probably want to keep in the deck for now. Sideboard, like most of these brews, like really any brew, like an unknown metagame first draft, is going to be pretty rough draft. Cards I really like are Disruptor Flute. This helps you a lot against the One Ring, against spell-based combo. I also really like Hallowed Moonlight. This is a pretty versatile sideboard card in general. It stops stuff like creativity, stops living in, stops like crashing footfalls, but also in combination with Felia, Exuberant Servant, you can like attack, flick your opponent's thing, and then cast Hallowed Moonlight to stop it from coming back, which is like a little nice, terminate draw card combo. I think you want Graveyard Hate. I think Hearse is one of the better Graveyard Hate spells because you want like really potent 2-mana things to hit off your Amtraptor, and Sanctifier and Vec is kind of a nombo with Flage, but you could sideboard Sanctifier and just like board out your Flages when you bring them in, so that wouldn't be too big a deal. One thing I felt like I really wanted after playtesting against Mingu's affinity list is something like Kataki to like kind of punish these like more artifact focused decks a little bit. Wear Tears were like just not really doing enough against that strategy. I really recommend this one. I'm excited to see what people do with the list. Again, lots of directions to go. Very first drafty, but has been super nice in playtesting. I think between Paper and Magic Online, we are 15-2 with Boros overall, changing a few cards as we go. I certainly did not expect to say this, but after playtesting Ruby Storm in the early access event on Magic Online on Friday, I think that there is a very good chance that this is going to be a real deck in Modern going forward. I know it's weird to say that. Storm has been not a player in the format for a very long time, but both Ral Monsoon Mage and Ruby Medallion are gigantic upgrades for the archetype. There are a lot of builds running around, and despite me being pretty happy with this draft of the deck, I think it's going to take some time for the community to figure out the best way to build this archetype. That being said, this is a deck that is going to win on turn 2 some amount of the time. We won on turn 2 on Friday at least once. You're going to win on turn 3 with a huge degree of consistency, and you're going to be able to do so while playing through a lot of interactive spells from your opponent. Simply put, when you're comparing this deck to more traditional Storm builds, Ral Monsoon Mage and Ruby Medallion are ridiculous upgrades compared to Goblin Electromancer and Baral. One, neither of these cards have blue casting costs in their mana requirements, which means that on turn 2, you can go Ritual into Ral or Ruby Medallion, and then just start storming off on turn 2 without having to filter any mana into blue mana. Ruby Medallion not being a creature and being immune to creature removal spells is really ridiculous. And Ral Monsoon Mage, going into my playtesting on Friday, I thought Ral was going to be quite easily the worst of the flip planeswalkers. After Friday, I think Ral is probably the best one. I found it easy almost every single time I played Ral on turn 3 to cast the card and then cast a ton of instants and sorceries, wait until I had cast at least 6 to saying yes to my Wind coin flip, and then -8 to just cast a huge chunk of spells from the top of my library for free. I was almost shocked how easy it was to cast Ral on turn 3, cast a ton of instants and sorceries, and then eventually say yes to flipping the Ral into Ral Leyline Prodigy and just -8 to exile the top 8 cards of your library and cast any number of instants and sorceries from among them without paying their mana costs. And the fact that Ral is both an enabler for Storm, a card that is letting you discount your rituals, and your Manamorphoses, and your card draw spells, while also being a payoff for storming a bunch by just letting you Epic Experiment X = 6. Card is ridiculous. And Ruby Medallion is ridiculous, and holy guacamole, we are off to the races with this one. The deck just does a great job of chaining together rituals, Manamorphoses, Reckless Impulses, Rin's Resolve, Glimpse the Impossible to make a ton of mana and then draw a lot of extra cards until eventually you find a Past in Flames to flash all these cards back and then do it again. And I'm really into playing Dragon Rage's Channeler in this deck to not only give you a lot of card selection while you're casting all of these cantrips and card draw spells, but to also dig really deeply for a Past in Flames. And it's great that as you're surveilling through your entire deck, you will eventually just be able to put a Past in Flames into your graveyard with Dragon Rage's Channeler, flash it back, and just almost immediately win the game. I found the winning the game portion of the deck to be pretty easy with Unstable Amulet. The 2-mana artifact, you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, deals 1 damage to your opponent. and it can also cycle. So this is mostly a win condition that has the big upside of cycling when you draw it early. When you compare this card to just playing a ton of Grape Shots in your deck, Grape Shot is really only, win the game after you've stormed. Sometimes you can interact with your opponent, but the fact that Amulet cycles early, gets discounted by Ruby Medallion, I think is really nice. And I was happy using this as the primary win condition. I did decide that the first copy of Grape Shot seemed to be worth having, but it's nice that if you play Unstable Amulet, you don't need to play a ton of these cards. In fact, I think you could maybe cut the 4th Amulet for the 4th Glimpse the Impossible. Glimpse the Impossible is a card I had a lot of resistance to when I was trying to play it on stream, but it's a new card. I want to give it a go. But I really liked this one as kind of your extra Reckless Impulses, Rin's Resolve. I do think it's worse than those cards because it's the extra mana. You don't get those cards until the end of your next turn. But instead this one sees 3 instead of 2, which is pretty nice. And you can only play the exiled cards until the end step of the turn you cast it. But for the ones that you didn't cast, they go to the graveyard instead of staying in exile, which means if you flip Past in Flames, you get to keep Past in Flames in the yard, and then you get to make a spawn token for each card put into your graveyard. So I found myself a lot of times just casting this and getting the extra mana to go off the next turn, which I think ended up being really nice. I liked Glimpse the Impossible. It's definitely not the most powerful card in the archetype, but I do think it's a lot better than Galvanic Relay. When I was playing the deck, a lot of people were asking me Spike, why are we not playing Galvanic Relay in the deck? And my reasoning for not playing Relay is this deck is really good at going off in one turn. This deck is very good at on turn 3 just almost casting the entire deck and killing your opponent. And Galvanic Relay, you can only cast your exiled cards next turn, and I think that you could maybe sideboard Galvanic Relay against decks with lots of counter spells. In fact, that could be better than the Empty the Warrens we have on the sideboard. But I think this deck is just so good at killing, and even because this deck has the potential to kill turn 2, I want to be able to kind of maximize the turn 2 kills you have available to you in your deck. And if the more Galvanic Relays you play, the less turn 2, turn 3 kills you have. And also, you just already have so much card advantage with 4 Reckless Impulse, the Rin's Resolve, the Past in Flames, the Glimpses, the Unstable Amulets. I didn't really feel like I needed more card advantage like Galvanic Relay. I feel really confidently that 4 Past in Flames is the right number. We started with 2, and it's every single turn we're just dying to draw this card, to surveil over with Channeler. I think you just kind of have to play 4, and I've been pretty happy with it at the moment. You also get Giganta as a companion. There's a little bit of conversation between playing the Monk, the 5 mana red MDFC, 5 mana 2/2, return instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. I think the card's pretty bad. It's 5 mana. Obviously, it's a land that can enter untapped, but I think I would just rather have Giganta as my backup plan. I'm playing a couple Goblin and Narcomancers, so I can board this in against Tron and Titan for games where I just want to go as fast as possible, which I think it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if these are going to be right, but they're kind of a little bit more experimental. But I really recommend this deck. I think, again, there's a lot of different stuff you can do. I feel mostly confident about 4 Channeler, 4 Rao, 4 Ruby, the Rituals, Metamorphoses, Impulse Resolves, Past in Flames, and I think you could mess with the win conditions a little bit, the Amulets and the Grape Shots. You can maybe just cut the Grape Shot again. I don't think you're really gonna have much trouble winning without it, but it's kind of nice when you Ral Ultimate sometimes to have the ability to hit a Grape Shot, and also it could be a problem if you Ral Ultimate and you hit all your Amulets. Then you just can't win. That might happen sometimes, and I think Glimpse is good, but I'm not super married to Glimpse. You could probably play maybe one more fetch land because your mana base has so many 2-drops that if you don't have Channeler on turn 1, you really want to fetch your Surveil land on turn 1. So I could see wanting to do that instead. But I really recommend Ruby Storm, which is, again, I was not a believer. Then after playtesting, I was just crushing everything, and I really liked it. I think I had a worse build with Amped Raptor and Flare of Duplication because I was thinking having Amped Raptor to sack to Flare could do some really cool stuff, but unfortunately, if you cast Amped Raptor from exile, you don't get to cast any spell for free. So I cut that package, but we went 4-1 despite our deck being really misbuilt, and then we were 3-0 with this build, and it was just looking super good, and then I had to drop to eat dinner. I was also really impressed with this Bant Nadu mid-range deck that I built. And I think that this is probably going to be the best way to build Nadu, or like something along these lines. More of like a fair strategy where you just use Nadu plus, your one of Shuko that you grabbed off Stoneforge Mystic, or you use Nadu plus Ephemerate, Nadu plus Spyglass Siren, Nadu plus Felia, or Felia plus these cards to just draw a ton of cards and then use your free spells and Flare of Denial, Solitude to just grind your opponent into dust. I was for a long time kind of struggling because I really felt this deck needed a 1-mana creature. The deck needed more enablers for Nadu, things that target your own stuff, and the deck also needed like more creatures to sack to Flare of Denial and to flicker for value. And I know Spyglass Siren is not the best card, but I think it so far for me, I felt like it really has been getting the job done. 1-mana card that sacks to Flare is really, really nice. Sometimes you just play your Spyglass Siren, you get a map token, you sack it to Flare, and then later that map token just turns into a card off of Nadu. I have not minded going Spyglass Siren into Felia, then attacking with Felia to flicker the Spyglass Siren, especially because the map tokens like help the Felia get big enough to like attack through some of my opponent's 2/2s, which has been pretty nice. So I know this is kind of weird, but like Nadu plus Flare of Denial is like such a good package. I think you should probably expect to see a Spyglass Siren just in a lot of your Nadu decks. But overall, the deck's construction is pretty simple. You have Felia, Stoneforge, Nadu, Ephemerate is kind of like these card advantage cards, and you have Flare of Denial, Solitude, Ephemerate as like interactive spells, and then you have kind of your cantripping creatures, your Coiling Oracle. Oracle has been so good. Doesn't trigger Bowmaster. If you can hit a land off your Oracle turn 2 and go like Nadu with Ephemerate up, it's like really, really, really crazy. I think that you probably want 4 Oracle in like all of your Nadu decks at the time of making this comment. Doesn't trigger Bowmasters. I can't remember if I said that, but doesn't trigger Bowmasters. I'm really liking Stoneforge Mystic also as like this card advantage engine where you cast Stoneforge Mystic. It's either like combo with Shuko, obviously not an infinite combo, but when you draw like 6 to 8 cards in your turn with Shuko and put 2 free counter spells in your deck, that's as good as winning the game. You can get Cryptic Coat as more of like a card advantage tool where you can like bounce and flicker it, or like put it into play, then flicker the manifest card with Felia or Ephemerate to like get a creature into play. And it can also be removal with Assimilation Aegis. People, I think, sleep on Aegis a little bit too much because they only think of this as like a tutorable O-Ring. It's better than O-Ring because when you put it into play with Stoneforge, it costs 2 at instant speed, which is really nice. But also, a lot of time, usually when you're removing a creature with Aegis, you're removing a good creature, and so turning your own stuff into like a copy of your opponent's Nadu, turning your stuff into a Yawg Physician, turning your stuff into a Felia. It's like the copy mode on this is really, really good. So I really, really recommend Assimilation Aegis. Have not missed Cauldron at all. Again, sideboards always kind of feel like they're in early drafts here. I feel like the 4 copies of White Orchid Phantom against like Eldrazi, Tron, Titan is going to be really important to like flicker this card over and over and interact with your opponent's mana. The rest of the sideboard, I don't feel super duper strongly about. I think these could almost just be anything else, but the subtleties, Pick Your Poison, Knights, Endurances have been fine. I recommend this deck. I think this deck feels like a very good like first draft of Bant Nadu, where you are just kind of bare bones, and I think you could like peel away some of like the Ice Fangs, Sirens, Stoneforge stuff. Like you could play just 2-3 Stoneforges maybe, and like 1 less equipment, and you could play more interaction. You could play like more subtleties of the main. You could play Teferis of the main. You could play Prismatic Ending. So a lot of different directions to go, but it's kind of tough to like make those deck building decisions because there just is not a metagame at the moment. Like everybody is just doing their own thing, they're brewing, things are really weird at the moment, so you can't really say for sure what you want to do about that until you until you see what the metagame looks like. Now, at the moment, I do think that fair Nadu is probably better than combo Nadu, just because you just draw so many cards and your card quality is so high, and just a ton of cards plus free counter spells and free removal spells is a win a lot of the time. That being said, I do have a Bant Primal Prayers Nadu deck that I have not been able to playtest yet. We'll be playtesting this at some point this week. Kind of different, but Primal Prayers is really powerful. It goes really well with a lot of the Nadu stuff, so maybe I'll eat my words about the combo builds. We'll see. The most fun deck I played this last week, and also one that I think is pretty good, is this blue-black Chthonian Nightmare Dimir Value Mini Reanimator deck. You're using Psychic Frog, and Sotoro the Infiltrator is really powerful card draw spells. Psychic Frog draws a card when you hit your opponent. It's also nice that Psychic Frog can like discard Bloodghast for value, or things you want to reanimate to Nightmare for value. And Sotoro the Infiltrator draws cards when your Drolf Messenger undies, when you evoke a Grief, when you Not Dead After All something, when you return something with Chthonian Nightmare, when Bloodgust comes back into play, Satoru was drawing a ton of cards. I actually really liked the engine of like having a Satoru in play with Bloodgust in the yard and Phyrexian Tower, where you just like sack Bloodgust to tower every turn, play a land, return it, and then draw a card. So that seemed really powerful. And kind of unlike other graveyard focused strategies, this Dimir list is not the fastest. Again, you're kind of like slower with these card advantage engines, and in order to compensate for that lack of speed, having access to an incredible removal spell. Flare of Malice was so good in this deck. Your 0 mana, make you sacrifice your best thing at instant speed was so nice. In combination with the 0 mana Griefs, has been a really nice engine here, I think, where you just draw so many cards and you just pitch the stuff, interact with your opponents. Been really nice. You also do have some like really powerful lethal lines out of nowhere with Giralf's Messenger, where you can go like cast Giralf's Messenger, sack it to Phyrexian Tower, that's 4 damage, and then you like and then you can sack it to Flare of Malice, or you can sack, or you can, sometimes recur them to Chthonian Nightmare, sack, deal damage again. Just can deal a ton of damage out of nowhere. And then also sometimes is sometimes is like drawing you cards off Satoru too. I really was surprised that Giralf's Messenger was so good for me, but the card just plays so well with Phyrexian Tower and Chthonian Nightmare and Flare of Malice that I think Messenger is going to end up being a pretty good tool post MH3. This is one of the most fun parts about Modern Horizons set, is seeing all these kind of like goofy older cards like Giralf's Messenger or Spyglass Siren in the Bant deck that are just like kind of obscure into really important tools. I was really impressed with Accursed Marauder as a sideboard card. 2 mana, 2/1, enters the battlefield. Each player sacrifices a non-token creature. The ability to like recur this over and over again with Chthonian Nightmare to make your opponents kind of sacrifice their board seemed really good. And I would be somewhat interested in playing like some copies of this in the main deck if you felt like you needed some extra removal spells. This is like the card I would want to choose. Notably, being a blue-black deck, you are kind of weaker to Graveyard Hate, but we at the very least have like Disruptor Flute for cards like Unlicensed Hearse, Tormod's Crypt, Nile Spellbomb. We have Flare of Malice and Accursed Marauder to deal with stuff like Dothy Voidwalker and Sanctifier and Vec. Feed the Swarm can also deal with Dothy Voidwalker, and Feed the Swarm can deal with Leyline of the Void and Rest in Peace. And so I think that I'm a little worried about right now about playing this deck in an open metagame where you don't really know what your opponents are doing and you don't exactly know what Graveyard Hate they're on. So if you're playing in like an open decklist tournament, I would kind of be more comfortable playing this list because you would see exactly what Graveyard Hate they have and like what numbers of stuff you need to bring in to counter that stuff. But I would be a little less comfortable playing this in a closed decklist tournament like a Modern Challenge. But overall, I like this archetype. I think it's a great first draft and I would recommend it to you. I played a couple different Eldrazi brews over the course of this week in testing, but this was the one I was like really impressed by, and I didn't really like the other one that much. But this is one that's a bit more built around Emrakul, the World Anew, and trying to spend 6 colorless mana to madness this card out. Emrakul effectively said win the game every single time I played it, although notably I didn't play against any Flare of Malice decks. Flare of Malice seems to be a really clean answer to Emrakul, World Anew. But in this deck, every single land taps for colorless so that you can madness your Emrakul. Notably, while we're talking about the mana, you can't grab a waste off Beseiju. You can grab waste off of like White Orchid Phantom. But if you're really worried about Beseiju, this forest probably needs to go into the main deck. Right now it's just in the sideboard against Beseiju decks, and you also have the ability to bring in Prismatic Vista to get forest, to Thief of Existence, your opponent's Blood Moon. But aside from that, I was really impressed again with Emrakul, and you might be wondering how are we madnessing Emrakul the World Anew out, and we have 4 Urza Sagas and 4 Sowing Mycospawn, which can grab Urza Saga to grab us our 1 copy of the Underworld Cookbook to madness out Emrakul. I think you could maybe try to play a second cookbook, but with like effectively 9 tutors, it didn't seem like too difficult to get this going, and also sometimes you just spend 12 mana on Emrakul, especially in combination with Kozilek's Command. I was really impressed with Kozilek's Command in this deck. I thought it was the best card in the deck by a lot. or Eldrazi Temple is the best card in the deck, but I thought it was the best spell in the deck by a lot. I've seen some people like Caleb D like kind of say Kozilek's Command is not very good, but I think Kozilek's Command is not very good in like the aggro builds of Eldrazi. But I think in this like much slower, more value focused deck, having a card that is like exile target creature, scry X, draw a card is phenomenal. Scry X, draw X, make X spawns was awesome. The main deck Graveyard Hate was awesome. This card for me, like when we were playtesting, I thought it was the best spell in the deck by like a pretty significant margin. I thought Sowing Mycospawn was awesome here too, being able to like grab you Eldrazi Temple, interact with your opponent's mana. True Drop Saga for value and for Cookbook was great. I was actually kind of surprisingly not that impressed by either Devourer of Destiny or Null Drifter. I think that these are cards that you kind of have to play in the shell so that you have a density of 7 mana spells to imprint to Ugin's Labyrinth. And they weren't bad. But I kind of felt like they could have maybe been a bit better. And so like it's nice that Devourer has this early game like pseudo once upon a time effect, and I do appreciate it for sure, but casting it was pretty underwhelming most of the time, and hard casting Null Drifter was also surprisingly underwhelming too. I was happy enough to evoke it early to kind of smooth out my draws, but I think there's a chance that you want to do like maybe 3 Devour, or sorry, maybe like 2 Null Drifter, 3 Devour, 4 All-Is Dust, but it's going to depend on what the metagame looks like, but All-Is Dust was, very, very impressive to me at the moment. It's also nice that this deck gets to like main deck a Vexing Bauble to grab off of your sagas. Vexing Bauble is a really powerful card, but a lot of decks don't want to play it because it turns off their own stuff. This is not one of those strategies. But yeah, I think this deck was really good in testing, and I was also impressed playing against some of the aggro-focused Eldrazi decks, which was not something I was expecting because I was kind of feeling like they just couldn't imprint to Ugin's Labyrinth that well, but it doesn't seem like that's exactly going to be the case. But if you want a non-aggro build of Eldrazi, this one was much better than the blue-green build I tested, and it was just very good overall, and is of course going to be weak to some land hate, a little bit weaker to like moon effects, although you have Dismember for the Harbinger of the make all your non-basic lands island at least. But yeah, recommend this deck. Give it a go. I was really excited to build around this shell for a very long time going into MH3, playing a mana base of a ton of basic lands. We have 14 forest, 1 swamp at the moment, 4 Arboreal Grazer, and 4 of the worse Arboreal Grazer. 1 mana, 1/1, put a basic land from your hand into play tapped, in combination with Flare of Cultivation to ramp on turn 1 with Grazer, ramp on turn 1 Flare of Cultivation, and have access to 4 mana on turn 2 to either play Karn the Great Creator or the One Ring. Additionally, if you don't have Flare of Cultivation, you can play some number of Phyrexian Towers to play one of these 1-drops on turn 1, sack it to Phyrexian Tower, and still cast that 4-drop on turn 2. I was pretty happy with only playing 2 towers. I could see 3. I probably would not play 4. But this deck is very weird. It's kind of like turbo foggy to some extent, where you're just trying to like ramp really fast, and against like combo decks, big mana decks, you want to play Karn really quickly and then either grab Liquid Metal Coating to just start blowing up their lands, or you're going to grab like a super efficient sideboard card for that matchup, like Vexing Bauble or Stone Brain or something like that, Cursed Totem. And then in the more grindy matchups, the creature focused stuff, you want to play Ring really quickly, and then you want to use 6 to retrace your ring over and over and over again to where you just have protection from everything turn after turn, and your opponent can't really do much about it. And then eventually you're going to get to a point where you just have tons and tons of cards, and you can Karn for Aetherflux Reservoir, and you can use 6 to retrace to retrace your Mishra's Baubles over and over and over again to just gain a ton of life, and then use Aetherflux Reservoir to blast your opponent for lethal. This is how I won most of my games, and it was like and when you're looping the rings, it takes some time to get there, but you do get there. I've really been liking the Black Splash for Pillage of the Bog. The splash is like surprisingly easy to do in combination with 1 basic swamp. You can get off Flare of Cultivation, 4 Golgari Rot Form as bounce lands. Bounce lands are really nice to like put lands back into your hand for 6, and also good to put into your play off of Grazer. And also the Phyrexian Towers do make black mana. So Pillage has been really, really nice. I'm open to playing a little bit of a different top end here, and I'm open to playing some more black spells than just the Pillages, but you can't really play Shieldred. Double black is just not actually a very castable casting cost, and I'm not sure what other top end besides Shieldred I would want. So right now, as kind of a placeholder, I have 1 Eternal Witness and 2 Primal Command, retracing Eternal Witness off 6, and then buying back Primal Command, or using Primal Command to find 6, tucking like problematic non-creature permanents was all pretty good. But it kind of this Witness Primal Command stuff did help facilitate this like turbo foggy, really grindy loop stuff, gain a lot of life. And I've kind of looked at like almost every other package of green stuff, And I'll say that Wizards is really hesitant to print mono green cards that just kind of like are great to ramp into on turn 3 or turn 4 because obviously, like, you know, they one man accelerant into really powerful green 3 drop is really tough. Like they would never print Fable of the Mirror Breaker in green because they know of how potent it is to just play this in like a mono green deck. And so I'm kind of looking a little bit more at like other splash colors, potentially looking at like black top end to replace the Witness Primal Command. But this has been fine in our initial testing. 6 has been really good. Tower has been really good. Flare of Cultivation has been really good. This deck is really, really weird. But just kind of as a selling point, why to play this over other ramp strategies is that this deck is playing a ton of basic lands, and in a format with Winter Moon and the new Blue Merfolk Moon and White Orchid Phantom, playing a ramp deck that's built around putting a ton of basics into play has seemed pretty nice. And it's also like you're really trying to play like a 4-drop on turn 2. That's what you're trying to do. It's a pretty different formula from trying to like on turn 3 assemble Tron, and it's also like pretty good to like have turn 2 Karn against the Tron style decks. So I like this one. Very first drafty. I think, again, if you can figure out like the best thing to do instead of Witness Primal Command, you are going to probably have a lot of success with this deck. And I'm still working on it, and maybe you beat me to it. Oh, also, probably don't play this extra planar lens. I mostly had it in here as like a fun of because I wanted to test it, and I also wasn't sure exactly what 15th card I would play. At the moment, I'd probably play Sundering Titan instead. But we have 14 snow-covered forest, so that you can extra planar lens, imprint a snow-covered forest, and then all your snow-covered forest tap for 2 mana, which sometimes lets you combo off with Aetherflux Reservoir. Like, I did win 1 game because I had this card. And then if they have regular forest, they don't tap for 2 mana. So that's why the snow-covered forest. This is tech I've gotten from EDH players, which is pretty fun, but probably not something you should do going forward. Before MH3 came out, I was playing a lot of this mono-white hideaway deck that's trying to use Windbrisk Heights, Collector's Cage, to try to hide away a really high mana value card, Marius Call, Timber Symbiosis, ideally Emrakul Aeon's Torn, and then cast them for free without paying their cost by meeting the hideaway condition, which is have 3 creatures in play. And I thought that this deck was pretty good and pretty underrated. We trophied at least once with it on stream. And the problem with this deck was that a general low quality of cheap white creatures, cheap creatures to flood the board with in Modern. Because what you need to do in this deck is you need to be able to put like 5 creatures into play by turn 2, so that your opponent isn't going to be able to just stop you from having 3 creatures in play to cast your stuff for free with a single removal spell. And so we were playing like Nurturing Pixie and Legion's Landing, just, not great cards, but doing this to try to overwhelm our opponent's removal. And looking at MH3, the quality of like white weenie cards, really, really high. Guide of Souls, phenomenal in this deck. It's super duper easy for this card to have 3 energy on turn 2 because you have so many zeros with Midnight Ornithopter to just have this be a 1 mana, 1/2 that is a 3/4 flyer on turn 2 that's also gaining you a lot of life in the process. And also, gaining the life is like surprisingly nice in this deck because your mana is kind of painful with like Horizon Canopy, Sunbaked Canyon, and then the Bolt MDFCs. And then Ocelot Pride, also really, really nice. Very good with Guide of Souls. I actually had one game where I had a Guide of Souls and 3 Ocelot Prides, and I was able to make 14 cats on my instep and gain 14 life. Card goes really, really crazy in multiples. And then you also get access to a Johnny Nikado Pariah, just like super duper good rate for 2 creatures for 1 card, 2 mana. Can also flip and do some crazy stuff sometimes, especially because you have some extra cats with Ocelot Pride. Was very impressed with these 12 cards. And what was the most impressive to me about playing this deck was like the quality of a Johnny, Guide of Souls, and Ocelot Pride, also in addition to Warden of the Inner Sky, made me feel like I did not always have to cast a big thing for free for this deck to be good. I was like, you just get to keep some like aggro white weenie hands, some go wide hands, and those are very often good enough to win the game for you. And something I want to do the next time I play this deck is cut the Halo Hoppers and add Force of Virtue to the deck so that you can facilitate that beatdown playing a little bit more. Be able to make your Ocelot Pride a 2/2 and have it not die to Bowmasters and Ren and 6 and make tokens that are 2/2s to grow your Johnny tokens, to grow, just make everything a bit bigger and a bit faster having this 0 mana anthem. I was We're also playing White Orchid Phantom in the sideboard for like Tron, big mana decks. I think that that's good. I like the Disruptor Flutes, of course. I was kind of disappointed by Flare of Fortitude in the sideboard. I was really thinking that I was going to be excited to board this in against opponents who are bringing in sweepers against me. But basically, every time I playtested the deck, the sweeper my opponent had was Toxic Deluge, which Flare of Fortitude doesn't do anything against. So I think this deck has a lot of tools against non-Toxic Deluge decks, and it's pretty bad against Toxic Deluge. But it's pretty powerful, pretty fast. If you like these kind of strategies, I would give it a go. I think I only played like one match with this deck, but I was really impressed with Young Dingo's Black-White Scam deck too. Dingo was playing this a lot during our paper streams this week. Again, shout out to Dingo for coming flying out, playtesting some MH3 in paper with me. And Necrodominance was like, this was the big card here, this like super duper powerful card draw engine. I think you're going to see a lot of this in Modern going forward. And using this to like draw a ton of cards and like a symbol Solitude plus Ephemerate just looked so good to me, where you get to like do that in your instep a lot of times, and then, you know, only discard down to 5 cards despite using the cards, you know, drawing more than 5 immediately, getting to use those cards immediately seemed really, really nice. I think this list is kind of out of date. This is like the initial link Dingo sent me, which I think the Static Prison got cut, ended up playing Cloud Shift over Not Dead After All because it's a Nombo with Necropotence. And then I think the Prisons and the Recruiter of the Guards all became Shieldrids, because Shieldrid in combination with Necrodominance was super duper nice. I think you should probably even just play 4 Shieldrid, because like you really kind of need to assemble these 2 cards in the late game, it seems. Felia was again really, really nice. Awesome to like Flicker Grief with the card. And I think there's a good chance that this is going to be like a better scam strategy than Black-Red Scam going forward, especially with how bad Ragavan has been, but, you know, we'll see. And those were the decks I thought were good, and I would recommend without a lot of changes, or just like I would recommend for you to take, you know, those lists, run it for a little bit, then make changes as you see appropriate. But we did have a handful of decks that like had some potential, some promise, but need to be kind of like severely reworked, severely retuned. So I'm going to go over those decks here. One of these decks I think needs a good amount of work is this like blue-green Shifting Woodland Omniscience combo deck. And I do think that this deck did what I wanted it to do. It was a pretty fast combo deck that was good at like turning a Shifting Woodland into an Omniscience, and I really liked that, having Traverse the Uvenwald as a card in a deck where you need Delirium anyways. You need Delirium for Shifting Woodland, and I love that Traverse both found your Woodland, and if you had an Omniscience going off, you could just Traverse for Emrakul and win the game. I liked being able to Traverse for Disciple of Freylis to sack Emrakul to play it again, because sometimes one Emrakul is not quite enough to win the game, but the second just always is. And I really liked Planar Genesis. It was awesome with Omniscience in play. It was awesome to like dig for Woodland, ramp into stuff. And I think this deck was very good against discard spells and counter spells. But the problem is that in this deck, you are very weak to Disruptor Flute, the new card. You're really weak to White Orchid Phantom, blowing up your Shifting Woodland. That happened a lot too. And you're also just kind of weak to Graveyard Hate in general. So I think going forward, I would be really interested in trying to splash a third color for either some kind of backup plans. I think Teferi Time Raveler would be really good in the deck as a way to like balance Disruptor Flute to stop your opponent from like ephemerating their Knight of the White Orchid Phantom to kill your Woodland at instant speed. A good way to play around Endurance is also Teferi. I think Teferi Time Raveler would be an awesome tool for this deck. You could also play Faithful Mending maybe over like Ledger Shredder as a way to like discard your Omniscience. In blue-green, the best looting effect is Ledger Shredder, which is why we're playing it here. It's also like nice that if you're going off with Omniscience and you play like Archaeologist, you bounce Archaeologist with Teferi, replay Archaeologist. It's like a good way to churn through your deck while you have Omniscience going. But yeah, I think that you could also try to be like a black-green version of the deck where you're playing Unmarked Grave, and you could be playing maybe Archon of Cruelty. Like using Shifting Woodland to copy Archon of Cruelty, I think is pretty interesting. And it also could be the case that in that kind of shell you could figure out a better backup plan in green. You could also be green-red and have like some kind of Fable the Mirror Breaker, Seasoned Pyromancer build. Seasoned Pyromancer is really nice when you're going off with Omniscience, where you're able to like cantrip immediately, and then Fable's like kind of nice as like your backup plan enchantment for Delirium. I'm not sure. A lot of different directions you can go. I thought that the card Shifting Woodland was really powerful, but being like super duper all in on this kind of made it easy for opponents to disrupt you with Disruptor Flutes and Graveyard Hate, and it was kind of hard to play through all of that. So First draft needs work. These are my thoughts on directions to go going forward, and we'll see how the deck can evolve. During one of the nights Dingo was over, we worked on this black green Necro Dominance Disrupting Shoal Sorin House of Markov brew. We're trying to use Sorin House of Markov, play this card on turn 2, use Nourishing Shoal to pitch Otacron Worm, gain 15, 16 life if you extort, 17 life if you attack, then transform Sorin, and then -1 to blast our opponent for a lot of damage. And I thought that there was a lot of potential in the shell, and I really liked having access to 4 Pillage the Bog and 4 Profane Tutor to just like dig really deep for our Necrodominance. I liked having access to Sweepers and Toxic Deluge. Toxic Deluge is really cool in a deck that can gain a ton of life. You just have the life to pay whatever amounts you need a lot of the time. And I like the ability to like have so many ways to tutor up Necrodominance and then draw a ton of cards, then use those cards still in your instep to Nourishing Shoal, gain a ton of life. That being said, I felt like this portion of the deck, like Necrodominance, Nourishing Shoal, gain a ton of life, untap Aetherflux Reservoir, I felt like that was like a way better part of this deck than the Sorin Nourishing Shoal part. Sorin was fine though, but one card that we ended up playtesting like one of, and I think should probably just be a 4 of in the deck going forward, is Soul Spike. This is a card that you can cast for free by pitching 2 black cards from your hand. So you can deal 4 damage to any target and gain 4 life. So this is a good way to finish your opponent off with a Sorin. If you dealt them like 15 or it's usually 16 with Sorin because of the extort. If you dealt them 16 with Sorin, Soul Spike is a good way to finish them off later in the game. And like it's kind of nice that like if you have Soul Spikes in your deck and you do this thing with Sorin, you gain a lot of life and you just kind of have time to eventually Soul Spike them. And then also Soul Spike, I think, facilitates this like Aetherflux Reservoir, just draw a ton of cards with Necrodominance, Nourishing Shoal, Otacron Worm, Soul Spike, gain extra life for like each spell you're playing with Aetherflux Reservoir. I think it facilitates this game plan a lot better too. And so figuring out exactly how to build it is kind of tough. I think that you still need 1 Shield, but I think you could probably trim down to 1. I think you could trim a Deluge, and then I don't know if you want to trim on March of Wretched Sorrow. This card was really good. You could cut the First Inquisition. You could cut the 4th Sorin. I didn't really feel like you needed 4 Sorins either. So a lot of different directions to go, but I really wanted to play 4 Soul Spike in the next version of this deck. And then I'm not sure exactly how competitive it is overall, because a lot of times when you play like these spell-based combo decks, it's kind of like you're almost just solitaring. Like I felt like this deck was really good at playing through removal or through interaction and like counter spells and stuff, because you were so good at like tutoring up extra copies of Necrodominance. You're really good at like discarding interaction with your discard spells. But it's just kind of tough to say how like consistent it was overall. I think it would also be really cool to try to play Grief plus Phyrexian Tower to like evoke Grief, sack it to Tower, cast Necrodominance, but I'm not sure if how correct of a direction that would be to go. So needs some work, but definitely a lot of potential here. Dingo also put together this really sweet Yawgmoth deck that we played against a lot, and I thought it was pretty interesting and pretty powerful. But the weird thing about Yawgmoth as an archetype is that it got a lot of potential buffs from MH3. Like you have Phyrexian Tower, you have Birthing Ritual, you have Flare of Cultivation, you have Grist Voracious Larva, you have White of the Reliquary. You also have Marionette Apprentice as a possible option, and I'm probably even forgetting like 1 or 2 cards. Like there's just so many options. You could play Chthonian Nightmare in some of these builds potentially, but you can't play all of these cards. And it also seems like there are things that are drawing you to be a more green focused build of the deck. I think Grist Voracious Larva is one of these cards. Flare of Cultivation is one of these cards. Strangleroot Geist to combo with Grist to flip Grist, and also Strangleroot Geist to sack to Flare of Cultivation is another thing that wants you to be more green based. But Dingo here has built a more black based build where he wanted to be a bit more in on Phyrexian Tower and Geralf's Messenger, and also specifically getting to play Geralf's Messenger to sacrifice to Birthing Ritual so you can have a 3-drop to sack into to play Yawgmoth. And one thing is like without Geralf's Messenger, there just kind of aren't any really playable 3s to get into Yawgmoth. So this is more of like a black focused build of the deck. And I was actually really impressed by like this like Phyrexian Tower, Birthing Ritual, Geralf's Messenger, White of the Reliquary Grist Hunger Tide package. I thought it looked pretty good. And weirdly enough, I felt like Yawgmoth felt really like high and clunky on the curve and kind of felt somewhat bad. It kind of felt like the worst card in the deck, which is maybe just like a gauntlet thing. But like there's just several times I just had 2 Yawgmoths in my hand, couldn't play them because play them early. It was like awkward on the mana curve, or it was just like my opponent was removing my stuff and I just couldn't Yawg. And like very specifically because this build isn't playing Chord of Calling, I think Yawgmoth is a lot worse. I think Chord of Calling to me feels like a really important way for you to like end of turn, set up for Yawg, untap cast, or like set up, then Chord for Yawg in the same turn. Without Chord, Yawg, the card Yawgmoth Rinse position seemed so much worse to me. And so this might mean that you want to be playing a more green focused build of the deck where you can Chord for Yawg, which I think seems totally fine. But I also think there's a really good chance that you could play like a Birthing Ritual Phyrexian Tower. Like you could play this kind of shell, like a Birthing Ritual Phyrexian Tower green deck without playing Yawgmoth Rinse position. It seemed like the Birthing Ritual specifically was a good card that didn't necessarily want you to have 4 drops in your deck, if that makes sense. I think it just seemed like it maybe would be better to curve out at 3, is something I've kind of been thinking. I was also like surprisingly really unimpressed with Grist Voracious Larva. It definitely had its moments where it was pretty good, but overall, I was going in thinking this was going to be one of the better Flipwalkers. Now I think it's going to be one of the worst, if not the worst. Not necessarily unplayable, and I've been working on some other decks with the card. But it was definitely not that impressive to me in this deck. And so, again, there's a lot of good stuff going on. And obviously, when I say Yawgmoth is the worst card in the deck, Yawgmoth is a really good card and a really good deck. But to me, it just seemed like the Birthing Ritual wanted to be like a lower mana curve deck that's a little bit more focused on like outvaluing your opponent, if that makes sense. And so I think on this black-based direction, I would almost be interested in playing like Chthonian Nightmare and Grief in this deck, and like being able to like, evoke Grief, sack it to Phyrexian Tower, play Geralf's Messenger, play Birthing Ritual, sack Geralf's Messenger. Like this is just like kind of enough value to win the game. I also liked White of the Reliquary. I kind of wish we had like a little bit more of like payoff to grab off of it, but maybe Spymaster's Vault is just enough. This card was looking pretty good too. I don't know. There's just like, this deck needs improvement because there are just so many directions you can go. So many directions you can go with so many new cards. And this deck just felt way too untuned. I'll be doing some work on it. I have some like really weird experimental lists that I think that like need work and I'm really excited to try. And I have some like really boring, like pretty safe, like kind of nearly just like last season Yawgmoth with like just some Phyrexian Towers and a couple other cards. So I don't know. There's definitely a lot here, but we're going to need a lot of brains on this one, I think. Dingo also built this really cool Grixis Phoenix Stimulich deck that we played against a bunch in paper during our testing week. I liked it overall. I feel like one big thing is it needed to play like probably 2 more basic lands. Basic lands just seem so important in this MH3 metagame with all the White Orchid Phantoms and Winter Moons. I want to play like 2 more basic lands. And then I will say I was impressed with Buried Alive. I thought this deck was really good at like casting 2 spells, then casting Buried Alive on turn 3 to bin either 2 Phoenixes and a Lich or just 3 Phoenixes and get really aggressive. And that was really powerful, especially in game 1s. And then in sideboard games, Dingo would kind of like board into like what was quite frankly a pretty bad deck where he would just like cut the Liches for Slickshot show-offs, and the deck is just kind of like felt kind of neutered at these points. And it was even probably wrong to cut Phoenixes instead of Demi-Liches post-board to bring in the show-offs, now that I'm thinking about it, because like if your opponent has Graveyard Hate, your Phoenixes are really bad, but you can just still cast Demi-Lich for 0 mana from your hand if you draw it, so maybe that would be a better way to pivot against Graveyard Hate. I'm not sure. But the deck, the thing about Phoenix 2 and like this build of Phoenix is it's very similar to builds I've been playing pre-MH2 that I've been liking and kind of trophying with sometimes, where I was like main decking for Force of Negations, and this build is very similar to that, but is playing Buried Alive instead of Force of Negation. And the problem is like the Force of Negations like really help you like, counter your opponent's Ring, counter your opponent's Karn, counter your opponent's Amulet of Vigor, and kill your opponent while disrupting them. This deck doesn't have very much disruption, and there's a lot of decks in the format that just don't care about your like turn 4 deck. This is a deck that's winning on turn 4, turn 5. There's a lot of strategies that game 1 just get to race you, especially if they win the die roll, and I'm not really sure how you're supposed to deal with those strategies without any free interaction. So I don't know. And like, is it possible to play a card like Force of Negation with Buried Alive in your deck? I also don't know. So needs work, but I do think there's some potential here. I thought it was powerful. I thought Buried Alive looked good. I thought Striker Rich looked really nice in combination with Buried Alive. I didn't think I liked Striker Rich before. One thing too is like in the older builds I was playing that had Force of Negation and Pick Your Poison, it just didn't really feel like I needed to board out of my graveyard cards. But when you have Buried Alive in your deck, and your deck is Grixis instead of Temur, you do need to like pivot into Show Off, which is just makes your deck a lot less powerful post board. So needs some thinking, needs some retooling, needs more basic lands, but definitely a lot of potential here, and I think a good first draft from Young Dingo. So one of the nights too, Dingo and I spent some time building a blue-red tempo strategy that's trying to highlight a lot of the new cards from MH3. Specifically, we're trying to figure out, like, is it good to main deck Harbinger of the Seas in like a blue-red tempo shell like Murktide? I mean, we have Murktides in the deck, but it's kind of starting to lose its identity, where you have one basic mountain to fetch to be able to cast your red spells, and you are still mostly a blue strategy, which kind of makes sense, turning your non-basics into islands. At the time of making this comment, Dingo and I both really disliked the main deck Harbingers. And I feel like in this kind of strategy, I would almost just want to sideboard them. We'll see, and it's possible, like, obviously this is just a metagame card to some extent, and maybe it just wasn't good for our paper testing gauntlet. Not sure, but it was 3 mana and like was pretty fragile and died a lot. And it's also just kind of tough to play this card in a deck where it's really easy for you to be behind on board, right? Like in these strategies, your creatures are really small, and you're playing a lot of cantrips, and it's kind of easy to just be behind on board on turn 3. And playing a 3-mana 2/2 is not a really good way to catch up on board. And it's also like felt a little weird to have this as the top end of the curve, like have all these 3 drops in your Murktide deck was also odd. Ragavan was really unimpressive for me in the strategy too. Like I would be kind of interested in just playing DRC and Bobble in addition to Tommy or Murktide, and maybe that would help the Murktides too. So in this kind of strategy, I feel like Harbinger should be a sideboard card. The biggest highlight of this deck for me by a lot was Tomio Inquisitive Student. Flipping Tomio wasn't that good, although sometimes being able to just like buy back a counterspell was pretty game winning. Dingo did ultimate at one time and won the game with it, which is pretty cool. But just 1 mana 0/3 flyer, attack, make a clue token. That was a really good card. That was a really good card for us in testing. Just being able to go Tomio turn 1, attack, hold up removal spell, counter spell. If your opponent plays into those cards, you get to use your card effectively, and if they don't play into those cards, you get to sack a clue. And so it kind of puts your opponent in a pretty awkward position. We also tested Unstable Amulet plus Tuned Narrative as like a card advantage engine instead of Expressive Iteration. Unstable Amulet I think is a really, really good card, and it looked fine in the shell. It was not as impressive in this deck as it was in Boros, so that like Felia to like reset your energy, or like just like less in on the energy cards here. And Galvanic Discharge was also really good, but I think I would just kind of want to play DRC Bobble and Holy Heat Expressive Iteration in the blue-red shell instead of Amulet Attuned Narrative, unless you can figure out a way to get more energy cards, but the problem is you can't really play Amped Raptor and Counterspell in the same deck. But it was pretty cool to like tap Unstable Amulet, flip a Counterspell. That was definitely nice sometimes. I'll say that Invert Polarity is a card that Dingo and I both ended up liking after playtesting with it. Choose target spell, flip a coin. If you win the flip, gain control of that spell. If you don't, just counter it. Being on the other side of this card, it was very like, oh no, if Dingo wins this coin flip, I'm going to lose this game, and if Dingo loses the coin flip, like we're just kind of still playing. It's not like we're playing a normal game, but if he wins the flip, the game is kind of over. It was a very scary card. 4 felt like kind of a lot, but we're just kind of playing 4 to get some reps in with it. But I was pretty impressed by it. I was pretty impressed by Sink into the Stupor, the blue MDFC land. This card seemed pretty dang good. And so I do think that will be like an updated blue-red tempo deck, probably. Tamio was super duper impressive. I liked Invert Polarity. I think you probably want to move away from some of the energy cards potentially, although Discharge is a very good card. It's possible you could still play the energy package over Iteration, but um, I think there's a good chance you're gonna be on like the Delirium package instead of the energy package, if that makes sense. Um, and I didn't like the Cascade Bluff. Stingo wanted to play it, didn't like it very much. Yeah, I think it was it. Just some loose thoughts. Do you think that this will be there'll be something here? Tamio, really, really good. Tamio is, quite frankly, a lot better than Ragavan. So we've gone through the good decks. We've gone through the decks that need some improvement, need some retooling, and we've got a few decks that are probably going in the trash can for the time being. This was the first draft of Eldrazi we played, a more blue-green focused build that's using Ancient Stirrings as a really nice card selection tool to dig for your powerful lands, main decking Thief of Existence for some extra interaction against non-creature permanents, also playing Drowner of Truth as a combination like late-game flood insurance, and also a way for you to have extra cards to pitch to your Ugin's Labyrinth, and also a card that's helping you meet your blue and green requirements for Ancient Stirrings and also Null Drifter. And I was really impressed by the colorless Emrakul build, but for me in this deck, I hated Drowner of Truth. I was playing so many Simic Guild Gates tapped. It felt really, really awkward. I was also just not very happy with Thief of Existence. There's a good chance that this card was just like bad in the gauntlet that we had, but it was bad in the gauntlet we had. It just didn't feel like it had enough targets. It just did not seem like a main deck card, and I ended up feeling like having them in the sideboard like we have in the Emrakul plan seemed a lot better to me. And Ancient Stirrings is a card I liked a lot historically, have played a lot of, but facilitating the splash for Ancient Stirrings is really awkward. You have to play a lot of basic forest, you have to play Prismatic Vista, Yavimaya Coast, and you don't get to play Cavern of Souls, and it felt very not worth it. And it was really awkward also to have like Drowner of Truth be this tap land, so you have like all these tap lands with Drowners, and you have Ancient Stirrings as a card that doesn't impact the board, and it felt very slow to get going. And then what's nice about the Emrakul deck is you have like Cookbook to gain life if your ring is going crazy sometimes, and Emrakul just like wins the game like the turn after you untap with it. You Emrakul, then you untap, and then you win was a really common play pattern. So like the damage on the ring in that deck was not nearly as big a deal as it was in this one, because this deck was just super duper slow and super duper like hard to get online. And if you've played the ring and you've drawn a bunch of cards, like you're just taking too much damage with no life gain in the deck and no way to like end the game immediately. So did not like this build very much. I did really like the Emrakul build. Obviously there's playing a lot of the same cards, but this build just felt so inferior to the Emrakul build and also inferior to the aggro build some other people have been working on. This was the first energy mid-range deck I built. I really wanted to play like as many of the energy cards specifically as possible. So we're playing, Tune the Narrative and Volatile Stormdrake in this like Amped Raptor, Unstable Amulet, Galvanic Discharge Shell. And kind of simply put, Wintermoon was like not a great main deck card for our Gauntlet. I kind of feel like Wintermoon maybe will end up being like a Plague Engineer, where the majority of the modern format kind of has to build their deck with this card in mind. Like, you have to, a Wintermoon is this 2-color card that any deck can play. And if I don't play a deck that can get a lot of basic lands in play or some basic lands in play, I'm going to lose to this card really hard. But if everyone builds a deck that way, no one will play Wintermoon. So I feel like it's kind of like Plague Engineer. Like nobody plays, typal decks anymore because of Plague Engineer. So there may be that kind of effect. But this card was bad in our Gauntlet. Volatile Stormdrake seemed like awful to me. I was super unimpressed by this card in the main deck. I was only really happy to play this card when I played it on turn 2 and my opponent didn't have any creatures in play, but even then it's like not a very good rate for a 2-drop. I mean, 2-mana 3/2 flying, hexproof from activate triggered abilities isn't awful, but it's still like a little below the quality of 2-mana creature you need to be playing in Modern. And so I think maybe you could end up sideboarding this card. Also, looks like the sideboard's a little off here because I've got 5 total Storm Drakes. Not sure what happened, but Drake was really bad. I think this card is like probably just a sideboard card against decks like Yawgmoth and decks like Nadu Combo, and maybe you play those in these decks too. But I not main deckable. I also thought Layla sucked. this card is like almost definitely gonna be worse than other 3-mana options in the format is my current impression. The extra synergy with like Unstable Amulet and Amtraptor didn't really compensate. It was really slow. It was really easy for it to just not be able to attack effectively into my opponent's board. It was really easy for me to spend 3 mana on this, and my opponent Galvanic discharges it, and they I spent 3 mana, they spent 1 mana, and they get an energy. It was really bad, and I just didn't like Drake, didn't like Winter Moon, didn't like the Laylas very much. I also didn't like Breach a ton as a hit off Raptor, and after we played this deck, a lot of people were like, Spike, this deck was bad, you still like Amtraptor so much. Obviously, I've been really high on Amtraptor during spoiler season, and I was like, well, I thought Raptor was pretty good most of the times I cast it, and I think it was good in this deck when I cast it, but I thought this deck overall was bad, and so I was like, I wanted to wait to reserve judgment until we built a good Raptor deck, and thankfully the Boros deck was like, the Boros deck is just kind of everything this deck wants to be. The Boros deck just kind of ends up, just doing this thing, but so much better. So if you want to play energy-based mid-range deck, stick to Boros for now. Maybe eventually you can splash blue sometimes, but this build seemed a lot worse. Dingo and I also playtested his Sultai Primal Prayers deck a good bit, and I do think that there can be a good Primal Prayers deck in Modern, but I think the Sultai build is not it. We'll see. I mean, I also think this deck was kind of misbuilt. This is also something Dingo was saying afterwards, is like Tomio was a good card, so Dingo wanted to play Tomio in the deck to playtest the card because it's new and it's interesting, but it's just like not very good to be playing creatures without ETBs in this deck, because you want to be able to get Primal Prayers into play and then like chain a bunch of creatures that you play for free together. So I feel like they should have been like Coiling Oracle, which can like ramp into Primal Prayers on turn 3 and can also like sack the Flare of Denial a little bit more effectively, where if you sack Tomio to Flare, you don't get any ETB value, but if you sack your Coiling Oracle, your Ice Fangs, your Rogue Refiners, you do get that ETB value. And I don't know, like the combo of like Satoro plus Greenbelt Rampager was interesting. If you're not familiar, if you have Satoro in play with Primal Prayers, you can just cast Greenbelt Rampager for 1 energy over and over again. It gives you back that energy, so it lets you draw your entire deck and then play Thassa's Oracle. But the problem was like Satoro is just like awful without Primal Prayers in play, and the deck was like slow, clunky, and it was really nice that you could use Flare of Denial to like protect your combo in your turn. I liked that, but I think if you're going to play Primal Prayers combo, it needs to be like not with Satoro Greenbelt Rampager. So I've been working on some different builds. I think I pulled up the like Nadu combo build. We'll see. I'm not like super convinced that this build is going to be it. I haven't playtested it yet, but what I like about this build is you have Nadu as like a powerful combo engine card, and you have Primal Prayers, and so you're not just so dependent on having prayers in play for your deck to do anything. This deck is using also Mana War to combo with Nadu, kind of like this deck is using Satoro to combo with Greenbelt Rampager, which is kind of interesting. But I don't know. It's also like, to some extent, we're playing the Sultai deck, and I think this maybe is how all Primal Prayer decks would build. It's like Yawgmoth combo, but you can't chord for Yawgmoth. you can't chord for Primal Prayers, and there are just like no good tutors you can play for this card. So yeah, I think you probably want to scrap Sultai Primal Prayers. You can still brew around Primal Prayers, I think, in different color combos, but I think this color combo is unlikely to be it. Thanks for watching. Remember, this was only week 1. I think a lot of these impressions and opinions are going to change. There's just so much going on, and one thing that I probably should have said earlier in this video is that gameplay was good. Games were fun, building decks was interesting. I had a really good time testing with Dingo, I had a really good time in the early access event, and I am super pumped to start playing new decks every single day over on twitch.tv/aspiringspike and getting them uploaded here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Be doing a lot more stuff.